One of the most valuable encounters that I ever had in my career was when I was in the doctoral program. My major professor, unlike most professors, had actually worked in law enforcement and had been the deputy chief in the Northwest United States. His chief, while he was there, was Pierce Brooks. And Pierce was coming to the university for a presentation. Pierce was a famous detective. He had worked the homicide investigation of a Los Angeles police cop who was killed that ended up being a book and a movie called The Onion Feel. He had also been a key figure in early profiling of serial killers. He was one of the foundational people in that. And not only was he a chief where my professor also worked, he was a chief in two other agencies. And these were not real tiny agencies, but he was there to speak. And my professor said, I need you to ask this guy while we sit and talk with him about how he developed his supervisors and managers. And you've got to understand that this is before I started doing leadership training. So I had minimal knowledge of not only the problems, but the solutions. And that hour or so with him was very interesting and informative. And as I look back on it, I got a glimpse into what is the solution for leadership development. So basically, Pierce, as a chief, would walk in the agency. He would know no one because they were not LAPD, they were other agencies. And he would begin by meeting the first weeks he was there with every sergeant. He would start at the first line supervisor level and he would walk up to the office of each sergeant, knock on the door, and when they opened the door, obviously they'd be shocked that the chief was standing there, the new chief, and he would say, "Hey, I'd like to spend some time with you." And when he came inside and they started talking, he said, "Tell me about yourself. What's your background? How long you've been here? Family, that type of thing." And then he would ask this question. He'd say, "Tell me about the people you supervise. How many people are in your unit?" And supposedly, say the sergeant said, "I have 12 people." He said, "Great." He said, "That's great. Who's the best one?" And the sergeant would say, "What?" He said, "Who is the best employee you have out of those 12 on a 1 to 12 ranking? Who is number one?" And that sergeant would give him a name and he would say, "Well, tell me why this person's your best person." And as the sergeant bragged on this person's interpersonal skills, their work ethic, and so forth and so on, when the sergeant was through with his description of this individual, Pierce would say, "Why don't you call him and tell him to come in the office? I would like to meet him." And the sergeant would always be shocked and said, "Really?" He goes, "Yeah, I want to meet this person." So when the best employee walked in the office, obviously he was shocked because he was walking in an office where the brand new chief was sitting talking with the sergeant. So immediately, if as most cops would be, he thinks he's in trouble. Pierce would take over the conversation, says, "Hey, I was talking to the sergeant here, and I asked him who is the best person he has in the unit, and he said it was you." And you can imagine how that impacted this employee. And he'd say, then Pierce would say, "Sit down. I'd like to get to know you. Tell me about yourself. How long you've been here? Tell me about your family and everything." And after he got to know this individual a little bit, Pierce would say, "You don't know how encouraged I am that people of your caliber are here working in this agency. As the new chief, that makes me feel very pleased that I've got this type of person out there on the streets and in doing investigations and things like that. And I want you to know how much I appreciate that." And that's why and I was so excited when the sergeant said that you were the best one he has. Well, after the employee left, Pierce would turn to the sergeant and said, "You've never told that person that, have you? You've never told him or her that they're the best employee that you have." And the sergeant would look a little sheepish and said, "No." He said, "Okay." He said, "All right, Sergeant, who's the worst one? Who's the worst employee of the 12?" He said it was always interesting to see the reaction of the "oh no" from the sergeant. And he said, "I need to know a name, Sergeant." And so the sergeant would come up a name as the worst employee in the unit. And he said, "Tell me why he's the worst employee. Describe what he's doing that you would pick him as the least effective person you have in your unit." And after the sergeant did that, Pierce would ask a very interesting question. "And what have you done about that?" And he said it was always interesting. There was always silence from the sergeant. And then Pierce would say, "Tell him to come to the office." And then he said the sergeant would have a look of, oh crap, on his face, but he would call this problem employee in. And in a little bit, here comes the problem employee into the office, who again sees the chief sitting with the sergeant. And he said, one problem employee said, "Well, hey, chief, how you doing?" And Pierce responded and said, "I'd be doing a lot better if I didn't have crappy people like you working here." And of course, that would shock the problem employee. He said, "Come in and sit down." He said, "I asked the sergeant out of the 12 people that he had, who's the worst one?" And he said, "It was you." He said, "What are you doing? We cannot afford to have people who don't do their job, have a bad attitude with each other, with the other employees, as well as the public. And I'm going to have to deal with this. And even though you've been a big problem, that was before I got here. So that was not my responsibility, but now it is. So here's what we're going to do. Based on what the sergeant told me, I see a couple of issues I'm going to have to deal with about your performance and attitude. And here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give you several things that you're going to work on this week. And a week from today, at this time, we're going to meet again, myself, the sergeant, and you. And you're going to have to show me that you've made some effort to change these things, that you're trying to do better. And if you do that, we're going to be fine. We're going to continue to work on this. If you don't do that, I'm going to go to war with you. And I'm not going to tolerate an employee who can't do their job as a police officer. So they would make this meeting for next week. And after the problem employee left, Pierce would look at the sergeant and say, "You know why you never dealt with him and corrected his behavior?" And he said you could see this look of shame on the sergeant's face. He said, "I guess because I'm not a good sergeant." He said, "No, son or young lady." He said, "The reason you haven't dealt with this person is because no one trained you to do it." He said, "We train police officers and we do a good job on it. But when we promote people, we just throw them in these positions." And he said, "I noticed that in my own career. I became fairly competent operationally as a detective, as a police officer, because of the men and women around me. But when I got promoted, I noticed that when I started being a sergeant, no one came and offered to help me. Most of the sergeants and lieutenants were in their own world, and I was by myself. And I made a lot of mistakes because I didn't know how to do this, and no one offered to help me." And he said, "I made a commitment that if I ever got in a command position, I would come alongside the sergeants and not let them have to go through what I went through. So, what we're going to do is we're going to work together on this problem employee. So, on the best employee, I'm just going to encourage you, recognize good people. But obviously, problem employees are more complicated. So, here's what we're going to do. We're going to meet next week. I will do 100% of the communication because I've done this a lot. And I want you to watch what I do next week and how I follow up with the things I gave him to do. Then the following week, you're going to do 25% of the conversation, and I'm going to do 75%. I'm going to have you start chiming in. The following week, 50-50. You're going to be responsible for half of the conversations. And in the following week after that, you're going to be responsible for 75% of the counseling, progressive discipline, that type of thing. And guess what? The week after that, it's all on you, but I'm going to sit and watch you do it. After you and I have worked together that I could teach you how this is done. Pierce did that with every sergeant. That was his first priority, is because of the first line supervisor and their critical role in a law enforcement organization. He did it with all the sergeants. Then he worked with the lieutenants, went up the chain of command, worked with each one of them, did the same thing, then captains and so forth and so on. Of all the police executives I've ever met, I never met one that was that focused on the development of his supervisors and managers. And because that is rare for us to help brand new supervisors and mentor them and teach them how to do things and come alongside them and use those magic words, let me help you with this. That is very rare. And because of that, many managers fail, but not Pierce's people. And I want you to think of this statistic that out of those three different police agencies, 53 police chiefs came from that type of development. 53 police chiefs were taught and mentored how to become effective leaders. One of them, I remember, was here in Georgia, and eventually I got to meet him. But here's my point: you build relationships, but you also teach and mentor people on how to do their job. Everything changes when you have somebody in your life who's willing to help you. And unfortunately, for most managers and supervisors, no one has helped them. Operationally, we were always backed up with more experienced people. But when we get promoted, no one comes and we're alone. And alone, you cannot do this job. Pierce did that and created for the future effective chiefs and leaders. And we need to think about doing the same thing. And not only are we going to mentor them, we're going to build a relationship with them that is very important, because at the end of the day, it is having men and women in our lives who help us that make us effective and teach us also to do this for the young ones below us as they move up the chain of command. Pierce Brooks, he's no longer with us, but what an investment he made in this profession. Thanks for joining us on the They to We Leadership podcast. If today's episode helped you think differently about management, take a moment to reflect and then apply it, because real leadership isn't what you say, it's what you do next. And the real enemy is our pride and blindness on how we are really doing. Only with the help of others can we truly make an impact on those around us.